Welcome back. Happy New Year. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're giving this presentation tonight. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who are here this evening. This is the first open lecture for 2014, and I'm very happy indeed to introduce Dr Simon Michaux, who normally sits over there somewhere. So he's on this side of the room this evening, and he approached us late last year to ask if we'd be interested in hosting this topic which he's presenting on this evening, and immediately it piqued my interest, if you excuse the pun. Peak industrialisation, we hear about peak oil, and this is something that I haven't come across. I did a Google search on him, and he talks about peak mining quite a lot, so he's going to take a broader brush approach tonight, but also talk about peak mining, I believe. As always, I encourage you to talk in class through the use of technology. If you are a Twitterer, please feel free to use the hashtag. It's on the whiteboard over here. Hashtag peak indust with an N on the end. And we will be able to do a search on that hashtag, and we can see what people are saying, and you can converse with one another live in this room, or obviously after class, after the presentation's over. And again, I say this every time we have one of these open lectures, but the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise is to be found in these areas here. We are very keen on having people in this audience discuss the topics that we present on these evenings on our LinkedIn page. So please go and check us out. And I think we'll certainly get plenty of food for thought tonight with Simon's presentation. He has a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Geology from QUT, and he has a PhD in Mining Engineering in UQ. He's worked in the mining industry for 18 years in various capacities, including industry-funded mining research, coal exploration, and as a consultant in an engineering company. And his areas of professional technical interest have been, notice the tense there, I can't pronounce some of these, geometallurgy, mineral processing in comminution, flotation and leaching. Did I pronounce that right? Blasting, I can pronounce that. Mining, geology, geophysics, feasibility studies, mining investment, and industrial sustainability. That was the last of his professional technical interests listed here, which may coalesce slightly, maybe, with what you're talking about tonight. In parallel to operating as a mining professional, Simon has done work in and developed capability in self-sufficiency and environmental areas, which I'm very keen to learn more about, not least because that's of interest to me personally as well. In particular, the environmental fallout of industrial development. We are videoing this, so I am duty-bound to advise you that we are being filmed, just in case anybody has any personal issues about that. And what's going to happen after Simon's finished giving his talk, which will go for about 50 minutes, 55 minutes, we'll have our usual Q&A session. But this time, compared to previous times, please raise your hand, and either myself or Karen or Janet will come around with the roving mic. And wait until you get the mic in your hand before you ask your question, because we want to make sure we capture it on the film. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Simon.
Way, or do as they're told. We will talk about the problem of peak industrial for the rough first half, and then we'll grade into solutions. And I'm going to put a solution on the ground of A, how this might go, and B, what we might do about it. Now, while I'm doing this, reflect upon yourselves with regard to where you might fit in to all this. Are these ideas useful to you? And if they're not, what alternative would you consider? Writing on the wall is simple. We've been talking about it for some time. Everything we need and want to operate is drawn from non-renewable resources in a finite system. Now, most of those natural resources are depleting now or will soon. And demand for everything we want and need is expanding fast, driven by an exponentially expanding population. Now, when all that meets, there will come a point where how we do things will change. Now, nothing of this can be seen in isolation. So we're looking at a chain reaction. So I'm going to put together a model that will describe our current network. And then we're going to look at what it might be pressured by. The basic unit of our current system is a corporate chain. You'll have a string of shops or a string of warehouses or a string of workshops, and they all report to a head office. And that business will have a series of inputs. Those inputs will be from other corporations. And by doing what they do as their business, there's an output, some sort of business output, and that is an input to another system. So a conceptual paradigm is this. If you did a proper relational map, it wouldn't look as neat as that. But we have a network of businesses that all interrelate, but we all connect. We all connect to certain things in the centre. We all use credit, for example. We all use petrol. We all obey the law. We all report to a federal government. So there are some things that bring us all together. So we have a very centralised hub. And we've evolved this way because it's been cheap and easy energy, and we've had it for some time. It's very fragile. It's isolationist in form, as in we don't really care. Each one of the people in these nodes don't care where their raw materials came from or what happens when we finish doing our thing. The idea is the market will fix it. And we're absolutely dependent on the idea of reliable communications and transport over long distances. It's unbalanced, high energy, high tech, and seriously unsustainable. Now, most people at the moment, when they want something, they go down to the local shop, they hand over this piece of plastic, and the operator then shuffles some numbers around on the screen, and in exchange for that they give us goods. And that is the end of our interaction with our industrial network for most people. But behind that there's a just-in-time supply grid that supports all that. Our food is grown in what's called industrial agriculture. Someone has to manufacture all those plasma TVs that we like so much. There's the construction of infrastructure, manufacture of structural materials like steel and aluminium, and the mining of raw materials. And all of that requires energy. What we call energy is from non-renewable natural resources, oil, gas, uranium and coal, most of the time. What we call mining, iron ore, copper, zinc, whatever, that's also pulled out of the ground and turned into things that we can use like aluminium, steel and cement. And all of that is then used as input into other things. We use a lot of plastics. Where does that come from? Mostly oil and gas. Our industrial agriculture has industrial derived fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides, all of which is derived from oil and gas. Money interacts with everything. We cannot do anything without it at the moment. This whole system is contingent on a stable climate and an unchanging environment. The basic idea is it's amazingly resilient, we don't need to worry about it, and it's there for us to make money from. That whole system comes back to these fundamental units: money, energy, our raw materials, and our environment. What that is a discussion for another time, but all our raw materials come from that stable, unchanging environment, or so we think. So it all comes back to mining. Mining's in a spot of bother at the moment, so let's look at that very briefly. This is called the Multi-Factor Productivity Index. It's an index that takes into account all the bits and pieces that it takes to mine a unit of metal out of the ground. Capital, labour, materials, energy, what have you. It has decreased by 48% since the year 2000. That is, 48% more effort is required for each unit of metal we're pulling out of the ground since 2012 back to the year 2000. What that means is that's cutting into the profit shares of the mining industry in general. What's driving that is this: grade is decreasing. It's not rocket science. We're mining out all the good deposits and we're not manufacturing new ones. The conventional mining formula is struggling to maintain economically viable. At the same time, production's increasing, driven by demand. We want more stuff. It's got to come from somewhere. Now, the revenue for the mining industry has actually increased, but at the same time, our costs have increased. It's no longer the party it once was. So let me show you what has happened to the mining industry. This is the plot of metal prices. It's real data. It's been indexed to the year 2000 to 100. And what we're looking at is the relative stability of that metal price. For the 10 years prior to 2003, it was reasonably stable. And then this happened. Something very significant happened to our entire industrial sector. The cost of everything went through the roof. These are our raw materials that support everything else. And so, what happened? That's the year 2008, the GFC, and that's the fun and games we're having at the moment. So what happened there? And I'll put to you its two fundamental signatures. First one is oil. Now this is counterintuitive because the heavy industry is driven by gas, not oil. I'm assuming you've seen the peak oil before. Oil production rose and then plateaued around the year 2004, at which point it was about $50 a barrel. And went along this undulating plateau for a bit, and then it was almost triple the price, and then we had the GFC, just in case anyone missed it. Let's look at that data in a different form. We're now going to look at the oil spot price versus the global production. And there are two clear-cut populations at a turning point of 2004-2005. Here, supply and demand was elastic. Supply could meet demand without a problem. Here, supply and demand was inelastic. And those points correspond. At that time, supply and demand did indeed separate, creating an inelastic market. The second signature was China. The industrial grid a century ago was evenly distributed across all continents. Now it's dominated by one nation state, China. Steel capacity and cement capacity, these are proxies for industrialisation in general. This is a log scale in production. And as you can see, China dominates the rest of the world. The dot in the middle is where they were at 2008. That one there is 2003. So, back to this. What happened there? Oil became inelastic. And demand went through the roof. 2003 is around there, 2008 is in there. And yet, production is many times larger. And what did the Chinese do? They built a whole lot of stuff that no one actually understood. There's whole cities without anyone living in them, or power stations that don't actually feed anything. I would suggest they're well understanding of the concepts presented in this presentation, and they're putting things in place now while it's cheap to do so. Back to mining. It's all about energy. Energy consumption in 2008 roughly it's natural gas and diesel oil and coal is most of it. About half of it's natural gas. Most of these mine sites are in remote areas that require a gas pipeline to feed a small power station. And then you've got your truck and shovel fleets driven by diesel. Now the takeaway message here is energy consumption from the year 1973 to 2007 has risen 450%. So now I'm going to pose to you, how will government and corporate culture actually behave while managing a needed resource in an era of scarcity? Now this is a question that we've debated about ad nauseum, and it diagnoses who do we trust in actually meeting a solution. And I would suggest we need look no further than the coal seam gas issue. So let's look at that. The CSG projects in Australia have been rushed through the system, a lot of the time many years before the public even aware what CSG was. With 2020 hindsight, almost all, and as far as I know all, were accepted without any of them being knocked back. And a due process, and I say this as a mining professional, if due process was properly followed and a proper environmental impact statement was done, and anything that they came across was unknown or not industry standard, then they would have done the research properly, then those projects would have been rejected. The 2020 hindsight, this is an observation rather than a theory. Private companies and government have gotten together at the expense of the people on the ground. And the people on the ground have had to resort to activism. They found extensive legal and political resources are arrayed against them to ensure the continued development of this industry. And the concerns is they're going to have their environment they depend upon polluted. The charge is that state governments, who are broke, have sold out the public in exchange for mining royalties. Now, this is hotly debated. It's also my opinion. I'm up for a bar fight if anyone's interested. Now, my question to you is, why would a democratically elected state government allow themselves to be put in such a strategically dangerous position where they could have their mandate removed? Well, we'll get to that. In the United States 20 years ago, the fracking boom took off and everything shot through the roof. And the EIA has come up with this perler, where conventional gas has indeed peaked, but unconventional gas is coming in behind it. Now, remember, peak oil will inconvenience the domestic sector first and industry second. Peak gas will inconvenience the industry first and the domestic sector second. So this graph is telling us peak gas is cancelled, peak oil is also irrelevant, we can all go home and get back to work. So let's look at that. Question: how does the EIA get these fantastic future predictions? Well, now they've been busted before for this sort of behaviour, and every gas play is not homogeneous. You have sweet spots. There are bits that are more productive than the others. But what they've done is they've taken the best productive bits and they've extended that to the whole volume. Recovery wells are also not equal. Some are a lot better than others. So what they've done is taken the recovery of the best wells and extrapolated that to all wells. Extend both those concepts to the whole field, sum all fields together, ignore the logistical constraints and process issues. Now, for those professionals who know what they're doing, they may well be outraged by this procedure that has been so widely accepted. But the data's in. 20 years this has been running now. The production of shale gas wells is very, very tight. It peaks very, very quickly. We're talking about 80 to 95% decline in the first 3 years of operation. It's much, much worse than conventional gas wells. What that means is for the US shale gas industry to maintain last year's production rates, they would have to drill 7,200 new wells each year, every year, with that number going up. Now, to put this in context, the CSG in Southeast Queensland is considered less productive than what's in the US at the moment. So this is where we're going. A group called the Energy Watch Group has put a more sober estimate out. This is the report here, I recommend it. Conventional and unconventional together, we've got peak gas of around 2018. So CSG and shale gas has pushed the date of peak gas back about 8 years. So there you have it. And there's a similar story for unconventional oil as well. So this is a known set of situations. Peak energy is here. And when it comes down to brass tacks, what would our conventional authorities actually do? They'll go with the money. Coal, this is where we get our domestic power supply from. That's also a non-renewable resource. There's a lot more of it. We've got peak coal around 2020. Mind you, that's 6 years away. Now, it's better state than oil or gas, but here's a point. This is driven by this big blue wedge in the centre. That's China's bitumen coal reserves. They've been going around the world at the moment buying up everyone else's resources when they've got the largest resources themselves at home. They're playing their cards very, very well, but in context of an era of scarcity. So let's put it all together. This is in million tonnes of oil equivalent. Uranium, nuclear is that skin along the top. I have some data to show why I believe uranium is not the answer. And then you've got oil, gas and coal. And that study has put it, peak energy is about 2017, 3 years away. So my question to you is, what happens to democracy and due process when there's not enough resources to go around on something as vital as energy to an industrial society? Here's the elephant in the room. Actually, there's a herd of elephants. This is just one of them. And the thing about herds, you can get run over. Our population has increased about 5 times in the last 150 years. But for every person that we brought online, they've demanded more energy per capita. Our life's got more complicated. We like our technology. More is being demanded of our existing system. So our finite system, called planet Earth, has had 45 times the demand on its non-natural resources in that time. Now, money. I haven't actually put anything in this presentation to support this slide, but I do have something prepared if you'd like to go through it in question time. Everything on this list is not just possible, it's probable. The world is held together with fiat currencies. It's backed by confidence as opposed to any real asset. Until we change money, we change nothing. So let's hammer that home for a second. Not only are all currencies what's called fiat currencies, but we're saturated in debt. The threshold is 90% debt to GDP for a nation state. If they rise above that, they've got to go to manage their economy, and to service that debt, they've got to go further into debt, which is why every single one of these countries is printing more money. It ends one way. There are historical examples in abundance to say such things. Now, industrial procurement is how we all operate. We're going to build a processing plant in Chile, South America. The engineering's done in Australia, the mills are made in China, the banking's done in Zurich, and the head office of the corporation is in London. So how do we do it? We do it by trading amongst these units in different currencies. But what happens if we disrupt, say, Europe or the USA or Japan as places to do business with? Or what happens if we disrupt the US dollar as a world reserve currency? What's interesting is what happens if we disrupt China as a world life support for industry? What happens to that network? The answer is it unravels. Industrial procurement will simply stop until we can reset the whole thing. The industrial big picture looks something like this. Decreasing grade, decreasing grind size and increasing depth all requires more energy from mining. Peak energy and the need to expand production to stay economically viable means we have peak mining. Rates of mining will peak and decline. It's all about money, so sovereign debt, fiat currency devaluation, a credit freeze and some kind of structural inflation, and the need to expand that monetary base to service that debt gives us peak finance. Now, if we don't have the raw materials and we don't have the money, we're not going to be making stuff. There'll be less plasma TVs and there'll be less cars. Put peak manufacturing with the idea of peak energy and the idea of a credit freeze, and you've got peak industrialisation. We won't see large projects like the Hoover Dam anymore, we just won't be able to do them. Put those two together, and we have the end of the Industrial Revolution 160 years after it started. Ergo, the end of materialism. Not because of an ethical or moral constraint, but a physical constraint, because we just simply can't anymore. Now, all of these systems interact. You can't look at one without another. And so I think we're going to see them in this order, and our problem solving will go like this. The first thing we'll see is probably a financial issue. Now, this is a well-established tradition. Generally what happens is you fire all the politicians, reset all the debt, reset the currency, and you grow into a new system, generally assisted by some war. This time around, we can't do that. Give war a chance. We can't do that because we cannot sustain growth. We cannot sustain an economy because we don't have the energy. In fact, while we don't have any money, we've got to completely rebuild our infrastructure to a new energy system, preferably one that does what the current one does. And that brings us to peak mining. We won't have the raw materials to build that infrastructure. Now, I haven't put anything in this talk for environmental climate change, because we simply didn't have the time. But if you've got systemic environmental disruption, the whole system's based on the idea the environment doesn't change. It's just not part of our thinking. But if we do have this, then what it means in a systems context is you can't run anything for very long. And the practical carrying capacity drops because everything shifts around. And as things shift around, infrastructure has to move with it. And if we can't build new infrastructure, then the carrying capacity drops. And to add insult to injury, we've got population overshoot, which adds pressure to everything except money, which is interesting. Now, most of the people in this paradigm have few relevant skills outside of what they have been conditioned and raised to be. And so the order of the day is willful ignorance and aggressive apathy. So, I put it to you, are these issues really unknown to the senior global decision makers? And if there's not enough to support everyone, how would those decision makers problem solve? And while they're doing that, how would they interact with us? Would they really tell us anything? Put all that together, and I believe this is the fate of our industrial system. We are not going to fix it by bringing in a new tax. Bringing in a new breed of politician won't help either. And because we haven't had any discussion with regard to what to do, this is what we're going to go through. That doesn't mean it stops, it just means that system stops. And out of the ashes of that system, a new system will be built according to new rules. When? This is the question we'd all like to know. The party's over when something vital is unavailable or something doesn't work. Now, peak oil is not the problem. Public perception of peak oil is when we get the panic. So the average people en masse understand that the world they live in is no longer possible and there's no easy solution. That's when it'll be on, like Donkey Kong. So we're amazingly insulated in Australia. We have no clue and we've got no plans to get one. This is a website called Global Intake that's actually based around the idea of civil unrest, where you've got green down the bottom here where everything's great, no problems at all the way up to a fully fledged war zone. As you can see, Syria is not a place you should go right now. And to put this in context, when I actually did this on 1st of February, there were some issues in Ukraine at that time. This is updated daily. And as you can see, it's in the middle, 50 to 59%. So put that in context in terms of colour. So there's Europe, Africa, just simmering below the surface. Middle East, look at Egypt, look at India. In Australia, blissfully unaware. And you don't see any of this on your Channel 7 news. Bangladesh, for example, is in a bit of spot of bother at the moment. There's North America. As you can see, the war on drugs is still causing problems in Mexico. South America, there's a few spots of bother down there too. civil unrest, while I've taken the time to show you that, is there was a correlation between what food costs and civil unrest. The food index is what the UN tracks to track the price of food. When that rises above about 210, we start seeing civil unrest all over the place. This graph stops just before things turn nasty in Greece. Now, since then, oh, here's another correlation. That same food index is correlated very well to the price of oil. And that's because agriculture is heavily dependent on oil. Now, since then, the price of oil's come down and the food index has come down, but it's creeping up again, and now we're starting to see trouble again. This is one of those elephants I was telling you about. There's a lot of them. This is one that's not that well discussed. Our industrial agriculture system is failing. I believe in organic agriculture, and I live on a farm with a self-sufficient community being built, put together, and we practice organic agriculture. Agriculture is derived from petroleum products, but that's not the only problem. Petrochemical fertilizers and herbicides are becoming less effective. Each year, more fertilizer, more herbicides are needed for the same yield. Right? And I'm now seeing things like the superweeds, which are resistant to conventional methods. Every year, about 0.5% of global arable land is rendered sterile by how we're growing food. And this affects about 50%, or around half, of the land used for agriculture right now. And this is 30 to 35 times the historical rate. It's how we're doing it. This is the Green Revolution outcome. When the first settlers turned up to Australia, the organic matter in soil was around 5%. And now it's about 0.5%. Now, if you're going to run an organic agriculture farm sustainably over, say, 2 or 3 generations, it needs to be over 20. So how we're growing food is not working. What do? Scrap it. Scrap the whole system, start again, and start in a different place. And as we're moving into a world of lower energy, it's going to have to be broken up to smaller scales where people actually live. Now, I get beaten over the head with this phrase a lot. If I actually sort of that's great. The problem. Tell me how we fix it. Well, let's look at us first. We start with the individual, then we go to the family, and then maybe a group of people like a town or a city, or maybe a suburb. And then after that a nation state, and then you might see nation states helping each other. That is the order that we will problem solve. And when we see a natural disaster or something happens, the problems that we look at are, we'll look at the functional basics first: food, water, sewage and power. Secondary order services are things like fix my car or fix that leaking pipe. And in amongst that there's the distribution networks to get parts up to those tradesmen. Tertiary order services is the manufacture of those parts, usually not in Australia. And behind that you've got heavy industrial manufacture and the mining of raw materials. This presentation is actually down here. But before we even get to problem solving down here, all of this has to be sorted out first, because that's the way we are socially. So the reality is we're not going to do anything useful for a while. With 20/20 hindsight, where no one makes any mistakes, love that, there is where we are and where we should be. So let's say we've got business as usual, and then we hit some kind of small scale crisis. And then we'll go through this loop where we have stages of human grief at all scales. Then we have the large crisis, and then our options are conquest of another system, write off and reset, or decay and collapse. Where we should be, hit the same crisis, but instead of going through all that, we should have done something about it. Right, but that's contingent of understanding the true implications of the small crisis. And if we don't, that's a forced transformation where everything is completely different. That's the inelastic supply of oil supply of 2005, and that's peak total energy in 2017. We're there. Do we go around again, or do we get forced through that loop? Who knows? But because we didn't do this up here, it diagnoses a certain outcome. It's not going to be a case that we're going to meet this in a constructive fashion. So here's how I think we're going to go. At the moment, our current paradigm is one seamless activity. I go to work in a white-collar environment, I get paid, and in exchange for that money, I go and buy groceries, and my life's essentials are taken care of. But if that breaks apart, we're going to go into three paradigms. First, defend the status quo at all costs to the point of irrationality. Paradigm 2, develop a low-energy, self-sufficient society to meet the here and now needs like food and water. And paradigm 3, develop a new industrial grid according to a new set of requirements. And we'll see all three run in parallel. Not everyone's the same. Not every social institution's the same. They're going to pick one. So my question to you is, what would you like to do? Let's look at how that works. Here's our model. This is what we'll see to start with. The current paradigm's got to come apart first. They're not going to willingly do this. First thing we'll see is trouble in the finance sector. And the ability for we, the public, to actually access that finance will be in trouble, like what's happening in Greece at the moment. At that point, anything to do with environmental concerns in terms of policy or money being spent will be completely irrelevant. And then we'll start all sorts of very endearing problem solving like bail-in and asset compensations. The current system has no exit strategy, right? And the legislation for this is on the ground here in Australia, among everywhere else. So of course they're going to pull a stunt like this eventually. The grid will crash. Finance won't interact with all this. I don't know in terms of time. There's different schools of thought how fast this is. Rationing and shortages. What we call industrial agriculture will be run by continuity of government protocols, and we simply won't be involved. The energy grid will crash, and that will be rationed as well. If any manufacturing is done, it's going to be what is absolutely needed, not based on whim anymore. And the whole lot that what we call industrial nodes will be packed off and sent away, and we will not be able to interact with it as in terms of we the people. It'll be rationed, it'll be tightly controlled, and will be doled out. I also think in this environment we're going to see a new kind of entity, a hybrid of what we call corporate culture and government culture. And there are a couple of terms around there at the moment. Big business and big government at the moment are indistinguishable. Right, that's now. In this new environment we'll see something new that we haven't seen before. It'll be run by a very small number of people, and it's going to enter into a world that of haves and have-nots. And the have-nots will be told, this is private property, this is our stuff, you can't be here, you don't have any money, you don't have any resources, why should we talk to you? There'll be a new finance system that actually based on a new set of rules regulated by these guys. And there'll be all sorts of military engagements to secure natural resources. After all, that's why we have a military, right? Yeah. And that is called paradigm 1, manic defense at all costs. That's what it'll look like in networked context. I will skip over this. These are some of the signatures I believe we'll see. We'll come back to it in question time if you're interested, because we'll get on to the actual good stuff. In this environment where lots of people are on top of each other and they are dependent on things working, we're going to see all stages of human grief in all things in all directions. There's a sad reality to that. So who will respond effectively? Governments can't because they'll be overwhelmed. Corporate sector won't be able to function effectively either because there won't be a market. But the people on the ground can have the flexibility and capability to respond once they've changed their thinking. History makes it so. There's been so many examples of it. Now, a new social unit will move from a household to a group of households, a village or a community. It was always going to be us. I believe we'll lose the power grid. As things get more difficult, the government will not be able to maintain the grid to the same standard it does now, and we'll see a probable contraction where power services will be withdrawn from regional areas and will contract around tertiary services like hospitals. So standalone power is now a useful thing to consider. So, in that environment, what might we do? Well, all of this comes down to those basic elements. More to the point, those three: finance, energy, and our environment, and how we interact with it. So let's look at that. if we're going to grow our own food, the environment is not a bit on the side anymore. We're going to have a very intimate relationship with that environment. If we can't grow food in a repeatable fashion, then we're going to starve. We don't have the energy to move on. So we've got to do land stewardship. We're going to check out from conventional sources of energy. We just won't be able to access them. And what we call energy will be drawn from the environment itself. Finance will be replaced with something useful, something we can trust by looking at it, and it won't devalue as easily. Recycling will become very, very important. Instead of actually making things from raw materials, we're going to recycle. This is a balanced, low energy, low tech and sustainable system. And I call it Paradigm 2. Now I did a bit of game theory with regard to what's happened in the past. And the nature of an industrial civilization is when things go wrong, everything crashes and people have got to look after themselves. And these solutions were more or less right across the board. So there's two scales of thinking here. One is the self-sufficient household property. How might we transform your household to become self-sufficient? And then there is what brings these households together. Have a job that is perceived to be needed by everyone around you. If there's not enough to go around, you don't want people thinking that you're wasting resources. This is my plan. This is my horse TJ. Now, your household capabilities, this is actually quite a discussion in its own right. I suggest we come back to this in question time. But they're the sort of things you need to look at. Everything that goes into your household, you've now got to take care of yourself or go without. So, let's say form a community in all these books. They say form a community, and then they change this topic. No one says how or what to do. Right, so we're talking about a series of village councils representing a geographic area small enough for people to walk to meetings. You're not going to drive anymore. Walk to meetings after a hard day's physical work. Their mandate will be what needs to be done, who will do it, where will it be done, and who benefits. And the tasks: land stewardship, communication, community scale crops, building of community assets like barns, and dispute resolution. And I've got this basic idea. Take a suburban block, rip out all the stuff in the centre, and you'll have a ring of houses around the edge. And in the middle, you've got your communal crops. Now, of course, the real thing won't be as nice as that, but this is a basic model. So in the middle here, we've got groups of, say, 20 and 30 people that could congregate for working bees. So they'll take care of themselves, and then they'll come together as well. And so then you can start having a network of communities where each one might specialise in something. These guys are running cattle, and these guys have got a cheese factory. These guys will support a hospital, and then they can interact with each other. Food production, required to be completely organic, no petroleum products, and you can't leave. So you've got to be very careful what you do with your environment. And things like you can't overgraze, and you can't grow the wrong crops in the wrong order. And it all comes down to soil health and water management. The difference between planting in winter and planting in spring, if you don't understand that, you soon will. Seed saving and soil health and nutrition will be more important than ever before. If we've got to do a lot of physical work, we need to be able to have good food. So, money. How do we do with money? What is money anyway? As a social institution, actually what is it? This is an intensely important discussion that needs to happen. What it has become is the central lifeblood of our current society. We're all in debt, no one's ever going to pay it back, so wipe it out. And ownership. If you've got community assets now, who actually owns those assets? Get off fiat currency and get into currency that you hold in your hand. In practical terms, we have four outcomes. Barter, the purchase of large-scale goods in gold and silver, using the existing currency and whatever replaces it. And we need to have a legally accepted choice for all four of those outcomes. And I would suggest food might become a nice currency in this environment. It would behove every single one of us to learn how to grow food without the need of buying anything from the local hardware store. Okay, I've got some pictures in here. This is a water pump that I bought. I can now pump water without needing electricity. You might have a rainwater tank, but if you don't have a pump that's run by electricity to get it out, what do? And if you just throw a bucket in with a rope, you run the risk of contaminating that water. This is the sort of thinking you've got to come to terms with. This is where I live, Castellan Community Farm, and we run a breeding stud, my wife and I. My wife does most of the work with the horses, and every now and then a foal is born. That cart that you saw behind my horse TJ at the moment is being refitted, and it's been christened Thunderbird 7. Makes perfect sense to me. This is my daughter playing with the sprinklers that she's not supposed to, but this is our organic farm. It's actually set up as a business selling organic food, and there's our chicken coops, which we've set up as well. Now, this is an interesting point. Information. At the moment, if you wish to do something or make something, you jump on the internet, right? Or if you wanted a book, that book, what we need is written down maybe a century ago. This is one of the books I sourced off eBay. It's about 80 bucks. It's fragile, it won't last very long. Find the PDF and print it out and bind it like a PhD. This cost about 40 bucks to do. There is no, it's not an antique. People don't have to be precious about it. It's been designed to use. And I don't need the internet. I don't need a computer, and I don't need a clean power source. You can do such things now easily. And that's the library we've got at home. So, we're going to make stuff. So what's our future technology look like? We're grading into paradigm 3 here. Rare examples of current technology. Hybrid constructions from recycled parts used innovatively in ways that we've never seen before. 1930s technology and before, what I picked that is pre-transistor. We could probably rewind an electric motor ourselves. We're not going to make microchips, we're not going to make transistors, and we're probably not going to make valves, or at least not for a while. But we can run a 1930s era machine shop because the equipment tends to be more robust and can handle things like power spikes easily. And an 1880s base level of technology that we can create from scratch from our surrounding environment. It's in our history, it's accessible. So we're going to manufacture stuff. These are the skills that we are looking at. Woodworking, leatherworking, basket weaving, blacksmithing. If you want to shape metal without electricity, what are your options? Either go without or look at blacksmithing. Now, all that stuff will require feed materials. And that's got to be sourced from our environment, by us. And because there's a lot of stuff lying around, we're going to recycle everything we can lay our hands on because it's going to be easier. Now all the stuff down here, like metal casting and pottery and all that, requires things like blast furnaces or kilns of some sort. And they would require materials to feed, or some sort of power source. We could, for example, if we're set up ahead of time, run a modern machine shop. But that requires supporting technology. Can be done. It's just you've got to be terribly organised and amazingly resilient to keep up with that, because it's based around the idea of a continuous stream of disposables. You might have a power source and a power grid, but to run an electric grinder, if you've run out of grinding discs, is it still useful? Now you can have energy sources that are standalone. There are options. They require a bit of forethought. I'd like to see a return of steam technology and the idea of a water wheel. So, let's look at our network. What are we looking at? Well, we're going to check out of the, we're not going to worry about retail and just-in-time supply because it's just not going to run that way. We're just not going to be able to do it. The idea of the power grid we're just going to disconnect from. Industrial agriculture either will stop or it'll be done somewhere else by others. Most people will be involved in growing their own food. So the industrial grid that we're going into is going to be a comparatively small number of people that will have to be supported by self-sufficient communities around them. Money is going to be replaced by something of physical value to industry. We're going to disconnect from all those resources. If we are going to manufacture this stuff over here, it's going to be simplified. We're going to take a hit in terms of quality in exchange of practicality. And again, that brings back to our recycling. Manufacturing of goods is going to be completely reassessed. Now, traditionally when we talk about industry, we do not talk about the environment. That changes now. We must have a closed loop footprint and we must not generate pollution. This is not an esoteric thing in terms of climate change. This is actually an intensely practical thing. If we're supported by self-sufficient communities around us and we're generating pollution, those communities won't be self-sufficient for very long. This is not a tickling competition. Energy will become self-sufficient units which will interact with everything else. And it's around the idea that there are vast reserves left of these natural resources. So what do we do with them? Can we use them, for example, to make the next industrial grid? Of course, there'll be a degree of intense discussion over who does that and why and how. That's something we've got to go through. So we're going to develop an industrial grid, and it's going to have like this, a series of interrelated businesses. It's going to be a decentralized network, and those industry nodes will help each other. I'll get to that in a sec. Supported by a whole series of self-sufficient communities to feed the people and to feed raw materials into that grid. And so we're talking about a symbiotic relationship. Periodic external input, long periods of dormancy, and very simplified technical outputs. It's going to function like a self-sufficient community where each business will actually operate like a person in a self-sufficient community. What I mean by that is you'll have a network of businesses that interrelate, and if one of those businesses has a problem, then the whole chain collapses and everyone's out of business. So if there's a problem, everyone will congregate around that problem and we'll sort it out. We don't really have an option on that because things aren't going to be that easy anymore. All necessary components will be on the same physical site. At the moment, if I want to source something, I'll buy it from China and it'll come through a warehouse in Melbourne and it'll appear 2 days later. Ain't going to happen. So we've got to go all the way from raw materials to the final manufactured product on the same site, which kind of limits what we can do. And what is produced will be very, very different and very simplified to what we do now. And it's based on trust. At the moment we've got what's called a contract, the letter of the law. The wording in that contract dictates what actually happens in a legally enforceable way. That's going to be diagnosed as a pious load of crap. And if we're going to operate in this intensely difficult environment, it's going to be based on what we can deliver. If we can't deliver what we promise, then we're out. Our word is our bond. It's a concept that we've missed for some time. Money. To an industrial grid that functions like this, what's money? Okay, food to actually support the people in there, but we're also going to look at things like, well, what if we can actually supply them with raw materials that they might need? Copper wire stripped out of houses. Gold taken from the local casino. Tyres. There's a lot of effort that's gone into those tyres. Recycled glass. Recycled electronics full of rare earth elements. We can't dig them up anymore, but our rubbish tips are all around us. That could be a form of currency. So let's look at an example. We're coming to the end now. We're going to make standalone steam engines, a stationary steam engine. Well, we're going to get recycled steel and recycled copper from the environment collected by people, and we're going to put it in a small-scale foundry and make steel ingots and copper ingots. We'll take recycled tyres and clay, put it into a dual-purpose kiln, and we're going to make rubber castings to make gaskets and O-rings and bricks, preferably separately. Lime, silica and gypsum, it is around. We'll make a cement factory and we're going to make a low-grade kind of mortar. All of that gets put into a medium-scale machine shop and another casting foundry to cast metal parts, all of which will require a power source of some sort, which there are options. And if we scale back our requirements, we are now looking at a small-scale system as opposed to a large-scale system. Those requirements are quite mature. And then all that is then manufactured. But we've also got the method of transportation to the installation site. And all the people to do all this. All of this will be on the same site, and each one will represent like a business node. If any one of these things has a problem, then this doesn't get built. So this, to be built, and for them to have a reason to be, all of those people will congregate together to fix it. No more, that's your problem, suck it up. Socially, we're going to be quite different. So, all of you, this is the process I went through a couple of years ago. What do you do? Where, how and why? What do you currently consider necessary? And what are the major aspects of your life and how do they work? And at the moment, what are your non-negotiable costs? And transport dependence. If you've got a cat and then the trouble starts enrolling shortages, you're going to give some of your food to that cat. That's why you have a cat. You're not going to ignore it. So have it part of your thinking now. So start the idea of processing, of restructuring your life with the idea of we're going to go through this transition. Right? You start from this point and you decide where you want to go. Pick a skill, pick a hobby, pick a reason to be, develop it. But you start from this point. And now I'm going to put my neck on the block and actually put out a model of how I think this will go, based on what I see. The current paradigm, for one reason or another, is going to find it difficult to continue to function, and in its place we're going to have continuity of government protocols. We, the people, will have all sorts of legal restraints around us, for example rationing, and our industrial grid will be tightly controlled. This group in the centre is going to want to know everything, it's going to ration everything. A lot of information is being collected at the moment anyway, and these could be things like, well, the rail grid, the power grid, telecommunications. And if stuff's going to be made, what's going to be made and who for if no one's going to be able to buy it. Now, because this doesn't solve any of the fundamental problems, this thinking won't work, and a lot of those, well, that will shrink for a start, and a lot of these things will just simply go offline. But not all of them. And then a whole lot of self-sufficient communities will pop up around them. And all these people that were contained before with things like austerity measures will say, screw you, hippie, and take care of things themselves, and that containment won't be useful anymore. And that'll be marginalised due to its behaviour. And what's left of the industrial grid will attach itself to a series of self-sufficient communities for food. And that becomes paradigm 3. And then everyone else will go, hey, that kind of worked. And so some of those industrial capabilities will start to come back online according to a new way of thinking. And they'll go, yeah, that kind of works. Maybe we should do that. And they'll come to their senses, either that will be replaced, and communication networks can start up, and we can start looking at governance again at a wider scale, and that is paradigm 4. It's a guess, for what it's worth. Now, all this self-sufficiency stuff is all good and well, but the biggest task in front of us is actually social. We're looking at a revolution in social, a revolution in perception and a restructuring of social responsibility. What we're looking at is fundamental transformation. Like I said before, this is not a tickling competition. As for all of you, think for yourself, no one else will. You've got a choice of where you want to be. Questions?